Do you ever lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, just worrying about what comes next? It feels like every time you open your phone, there's a new prediction screaming for your attention. The stock market is about to crash. AI is coming for your job by next Tuesday. Or the political landscape is shifting under your feet yet again. It's loud, isn't it? It's relentless. And there is a real, tangible pain in trying to prepare for events that haven't even happened yet. You're constantly scanning the horizon, trying to guess which way the wind will blow, hoping you don't get caught in the storm. It's exhausting trying to outsmart the future.
But here is the thing. Most of that anxiety is misplaced. We are obsessed with predicting the changing world, but we almost completely ignore the things that stay the same. That is the core conflict at the heart of Morgan Housel's book, Same as Ever. Housel argues that while we can't predict the stock market in 2030 or who will win the next election, we can predict how people will behave. We know that fear, greed, tribalism, and overconfidence are going to look exactly the same 10 years from now as they did 100 years ago.
There's a famous story about Jeff Bezos. People would constantly ask him, "What's going to change in the next 10 years?" And he said that was the wrong question. The more important question is, what is not going to change? Because you can build a business and a life around the things that are stable. If you shift your focus from the chaos of the unknown to the certainty of human nature, that paralyzed feeling starts to fade. You stop trying to predict the weather, and you start building a better shelter. So if we accept that the future is built on these timeless human behaviors, what are they? In the next segment, we're going to look at why the biggest risks are never the ones you see on the news.
You are listening to The Last Read, books for your ears, wisdom for your life. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now. You really don't want to miss the future wisdom we have lined up for you. Today, we are diving deep into Same as Ever by Morgan Housel.
Our agenda for this series is distinct. Instead of looking for a crystal ball to tell us exactly what the world will look like in 2030, we are going to build a foundation on the unchangeable behaviors of history. We are going to stop trying to predict the wind and focus on adjusting the sails. By the end of this series, I believe you will have the secret to a level of financial and mental stability that 99% of people completely miss. And they miss it for a very specific reason. They are too busy watching the news. They are hyper-focused on the changing details while missing the permanent patterns underneath. But to understand why this approach is so potent, you first need to understand the man behind the message. Because Morgan Housel isn't your typical finance guru.
You see, Morgan Housel occupies a unique space in the modern financial world. He is a partner at the Collaborative Fund and a former columnist for the Wall Street Journal. But those titles don't quite capture the essence of what he actually does. And that is the key distinction. Housel is not your typical finance guru. He doesn't spend his time analyzing spreadsheets, staring at yield curves, or obsessing over quarterly earnings reports. Instead, he is a historian of human behavior. He understands that while the technical tools of finance have changed dramatically over the last century, the brain using those tools has not changed at all. He looks at how we feel, how we fear, and how we dream. He studies the stories we tell ourselves when the market crashes, and the arrogance we display when the market soars. Same as Ever is his guide to these constants. It is a collection of observations on the things that never change, regardless of technology or time. It is about understanding the permanent rules of the game, so you aren't constantly thrown off balance by the changing players.
And one of the most critical lessons he offers right out of the gate concerns the fragility of history itself. We often look back at the past and assume that what happened was inevitable, that the world we live in today was destined to exist exactly as it does. But Housel suggests that history, and by extension, our future, is actually far more precarious than we realize. It turns out the course of the entire world can shift on a dime, hanging by the absolute thinnest of threads, influenced by events so small and random that they are impossible to predict, yet impossible to ignore.
Take the Battle of Long Island in August 1776. George Washington's army is completely cornered. You have the British fleet, about 400 ships, sitting right there in the harbor, ready to sail up the East River and cut off any chance of retreat. It looked like the end of the Revolutionary War before it had barely begun. But then, a strange thing happened. The wind wasn't blowing in the right direction, so the British ships couldn't sail up the river. And then, a thick, heavy fog rolled in, concealing Washington's troops as they silently escaped across the water under the cover of darkness. Historian David McCullough once said that if the wind had blown differently that night, the United States of America likely wouldn't exist. Think about that for a second. The existence of a global superpower came down to a random weather pattern in New York over 200 years ago.
Housel uses this story to drive home a terrifying yet essential point. History hangs by a thread. We like to think the world is a neat cause and effect machine, but in reality, the biggest outcomes are often determined by the smallest, most random accidents. And this leads us to one of the most important definitions in the book. Housel says, risk is what you don't see. We spend all this time trying to predict the future. We look at economic forecasts, we listen to pundits, but the events that actually change the world are the ones that are impossible to forecast. Think about the events that have defined the last 20 years. September 11th, the 2008 financial crisis, COVID-19. None of these were in the top 10 risks reports the year before they happened.
If a risk is in the news, if people are talking about it, then it's already priced in. You can prepare for it. The real danger, the black swan event, to use the famous metaphor, is the thing that comes out of nowhere. It's the surprise that hits you simply because you couldn't imagine it happening. So, Housel argues that trying to predict the next big thing is a fool's errand. You can't plan for specific black swans. You can only plan for the fact that something unpredictable will inevitably happen. Now, accepting that the world is this chaotic, this fragile, can be incredibly stressful. It makes us feel like we have no control. And usually, when we feel out of control, we try to compensate by achieving more. We think, if I just get that promotion, if I just make $1 million, then I'll feel secure, then I'll be happy. But Housel warns that there is a trap waiting for us there, a psychological mechanism that keeps us running in place no matter how much we achieve.
And that trap is best summarized by a simple yet somewhat terrifying equation that Housel highlights. Happiness equals results minus expectations. It sounds simple enough, almost mathematical, but it explains so much of our modern anxiety. Housel invites us to look back at the 1950s in the United States, an era often romanticized as the golden age of the American middle class. We see the photos of smiling families in the suburbs and assume they must have been incredibly wealthy to be that content. But if you actually look at the statistics, the median family in the 1950s had significantly less wealth than the median family today. Their homes were tiny, usually around 1,000 square feet. They didn't have air conditioning, they had fewer clothes, the food was bland, and healthcare was primitive compared to what we have now. By almost every objective material standard, we are living like kings compared to them. So why did they seem happier? Or at least, why did they feel more satisfied? Housel argues it's because the gap between what they had and what they wanted was small. In the 1950s, you looked at your neighbor and they had roughly the same stuff you did. The CEO of the company didn't make 500 times what the average worker made. Maybe they made 20 or 30 times more. The goalposts were visible and they were stationary.
But today, the economy has grown massive and our standard of living has skyrocketed. Yet our expectations have risen in tandem, or perhaps even faster. We don't compare ourselves to our neighbors anymore. We open Instagram and compare ourselves to the top 1% of the world. This creates a phenomenon often called the hedonic treadmill. You run and run, you achieve more, but you never actually move forward in terms of satisfaction because you keep moving the finish line. Think about a modern example, something very typical in the US. Let's say you grind for years and finally land that senior vice president role. You get a massive raise. To celebrate, you go out and buy a Model S, or perhaps a luxury SUV. For the first 48 hours, you are on cloud 9. The leather smells perfect. The acceleration is intoxicating. You feel like you've made it. But then, life happens. A month goes by, then 2 months. The dopamine wears off. You get a scratch on the bumper. You get stuck in gridlock traffic just like everyone else.
Suddenly, it's not a symbol of success anymore. It's just your car. It's just transportation. Your baseline for normal has shifted up to meet your new income, and you find yourself looking for the next thing that will finally make you happy. Housel's point here is crucial. If your expectations rise as fast as your income, you will never be happy with your money, no matter how much of it you accumulate. You can't win a race where the finish line moves every time you take a step. The only way to win, the only way to find stability in this chaotic world, is to control the goalpost. It is to stop the expectations from inflating. It's realizing that getting what you want is easy, but wanting what you get is the real challenge. Now, this brings us to a difficult realization about how we perceive value and success. We like to think we are rational creatures, that we look at the data, we look at the bank account, and we calculate our next move logically. We think the best numbers win. But Housel suggests that is fundamentally wrong. We aren't calculation machines, we are emotional machines, and in the real world, the person with the best spreadsheet rarely wins. The person who wins is usually the one telling the most compelling story.
Which means, if you want to understand why the world looks the way it does, you have to look at the stories, not just the statistics. Housel has a chapter in the book called Best Story Wins, and the core argument is something that frustrates a lot of analytical people. The best idea, the right answer, or the most accurate data rarely wins. The thing that wins is always the most compelling story. Think about it like this. You could have a brilliant scientist who cures a disease, but if they are inarticulate and write a dry, jargon-filled paper that no one reads, they might go unnoticed. Meanwhile, Morgan Freeman could read a grocery list and bring people to tears. Housel uses the example of Ken Burns, the famous documentarian. When Burns released his Civil War documentary in 1990, more Americans watched it than watched the Super Bowl that year. Now think about that. He wasn't breaking new news. He didn't discover some secret cache of letters that changed the outcome of the war. We all knew how it ended. The facts were the same as they had been for 130 years. But Burns didn't just give facts. He told a story. He used music, timing, emotion. He made the facts sing.
And because he had the best story, he won the attention of the nation. This applies directly to money and the economy. Housel argues that every economic valuation is just a number from today multiplied by a story about tomorrow. When the story is strong, we get bubbles. Look at the dot-com boom or the recent crypto crazes. If you looked at the math, if you looked at the revenue, it didn't make sense. It often looked ridiculous. But the story? The story was about a new future, about democratization, about changing the world. And when the story is that good, people will ignore the data. They will ignore the logic. Because as Housel quotes the historian Will Durant, logic is an invention of man and may be ignored by the universe. We saw this with Tesla for years. Critics would scream about the balance sheet. They'd point to the production numbers.
But Elon Musk wasn't just selling cars. He was selling a story about the future of energy. And for a long time, that story was worth more to the market than the actual cars being sold.
So the lesson here isn't to be cynical, it's to be realistic. In your own career, in your life, being right isn't enough. You can have the best spreadsheet in the meeting, you can have the correct engineering solution, but if you can't wrap it in a story that makes people nod their heads, you will lose to the person who can. We are swayed by narrative, not by numbers. But here is the catch. Relying on stories and believing in a bright future is essential for growth. You need that optimism to invest and to build. But if you get too caught up in the story, if you ignore the risks entirely, you get wiped out. So how do you balance that? How do you believe in the long-term story without getting crushed by short-term reality? Well, Housel suggests you need to adopt a very specific and somewhat paradoxical personality type. You need to become what he calls an optimistic pessimist. It sounds like a contradiction, but it might actually be the secret to survival.
This is what Morgan Housel calls the rational optimist, or more memorably, the optimistic pessimist. It sounds like a personality disorder, doesn't it? Like you can't make up your mind. But Housel argues it is actually the most functional way to view the world. Here is the breakdown. Usually, we think of optimism and pessimism as binary. You are either the person seeing the glass half full or the person seeing it half empty. But in finance and in life, you actually need to be both, just on different timelines. Housel's rule is simple. Save like a pessimist and invest like an optimist. Think about it this way. You need to be paranoid about the short term. You have to assume that the economy will crash, that you might lose your job, that a pandemic might hit, or that your biggest client will walk away tomorrow. That is the pessimism. That is what keeps you safe. It forces you to keep a cash buffer, to avoid massive leverage, and to never take a risk that could wipe you out completely.
But at the exact same time, you need to be wildly optimistic about the long term. You have to believe that despite all those short-term disasters, humanity solves problems, businesses grow, and the line on the chart eventually goes up and to the right. The problem is, most people pick just one. If you are pure optimist, you leverage everything to the hilt because stocks only go up. Then a recession hits and you get washed out before the recovery happens. If you are pure pessimist, you keep all your money under the mattress because the world is ending. You survive the crash, but you miss the life-changing growth that follows. Housel uses a great logic here that I want to illustrate with a metaphor. Imagine a marathon runner. Your goal is to finish the race. That is the long-term optimism. You visualize crossing the finish line, the medal around your neck, the glory. That belief keeps you moving forward. But if you don't watch your step at mile 3 and you trip over a pothole and break your leg, it doesn't matter how optimistic you were about the finish line. You are out of the race. The short-term paranoia, watching for the pothole, is what earns you the right to enjoy the long-term result.
History is full of people who had the right long-term idea, but the wrong short-term survival strategy. They were right about the internet, but they went broke in 2000. They were right about real estate, but they got foreclosed on in 2008. As Housel puts it, you can only be an optimist in the long run if you are pessimistic enough to survive the short run. So look at your own finances. Look at your own career. Do you have enough paranoia built in? Enough savings, enough redundancy to survive a bad year? Because if you can survive the bad year, you get to stick around for the golden decade. It's a powerful framework. It stops you from trying to predict exactly what will happen next week and shifts your focus to something much more important, being durable enough to handle whatever happens. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. We spend so much time obsessing over the future, trying to guess the next big innovation or the next election result. But Housel argues we are looking in the wrong direction. Instead of asking what will change, we should be asking a much more important question.
What is not going to change in the next 10 years? That is the question Jeff Bezos famously says he almost never gets asked, but it's actually the more important one. Think about it. You can't build a strategy around things that might change. You can't invest your life savings on a guess about who wins the next election or what the stock market does next Tuesday. That's gambling. But you can build a life around the things that never change. Bezos knew that in 10 years, customers would still want low prices and fast shipping. That wasn't going to change, so he could pour billions into it with total confidence. And Housel argues we should do the same with our lives. The technologies we use will look totally different in 50 years. Artificial intelligence, space travel, whatever comes next. But the humans using that technology, they'll be exactly the same.
We will still be driven by greed and fear. We will still be persuaded by a good story more than a cold statistic. And we will still be terrible at predicting the future. That is the core message of same as ever. If you want to win in the long run, stop trying to be a fortune teller. Instead, focus on the behaviors that have been true for the last 500 years, because they'll probably be true for the next 500. Focus on the best story wins, realizing that the most rational idea isn't always the one that succeeds. It's usually the one with the most compelling narrative. Focus on managing your expectations. As Housel writes, the first rule of happiness is low expectations. If you expect the world to be perfect, you'll be miserable. If you expect chaos and prepare for it, you'll be unbreakable. And most importantly, focus on survival.
The world is full of risks you can't see coming. Housel reminds us that risk is what's left over after you think you've thought of everything. So don't just plan for the risks you can imagine. Build enough room for error in your finances and your career to handle the risks you can't imagine. It is a deeply comforting philosophy. You don't have to be smarter than everyone else. You don't have to predict the next big thing. You just have to understand the human animals driving the machine. Because while the world changes, the rules of the game remain the same as ever. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next breakdown. And if you want to dig into these stories yourself, and I highly recommend you do, because Housel is a master storyteller, click the link in the description to pick up a copy of the book. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.